Imagine stepping into an English garden just as the sun begins its slow descent in the late spring sky. The air is mild, tinged with the scent of freshly cut grass, and there's a stillness that feels both comforting and quietly melancholy. Over in one corner, near a set of flowering apple trees, you notice a lanky young man with gentle, faraway eyes. He's settled on a small wooden stool, a guitar balanced across his knees. He strums a chord that rings out soft and pure, then pauses as if deciding which musical path to follow next. He begins to sing, and his voice is hushed yet luminous, like a distant light guiding you through twilight. The song floats across the garden, ephemeral as a dream you can't quite recall. Listen carefully, and it's as though the entire orchard leans in to catch every note. He was born Nicholas Rodney Drake on June 19, 1948, in Rangoon, now Yangon, in Burma, an unassuming arrival at a small company hospital. His father, Rodney Drake, worked as a wood engineer in the midst of a world that had yet to fully recover from the ravages of World War II, and his mother, Molly, was a gifted amateur pianist and poet. As the monsoon rains drummed on hospital rooftops, Molly cradled her newborn son, already composing little lullabies in her mind. Even from these earliest days it was music, soft, contemplative, and tinged with longing, that first surrounded Nick. The Drakes lived amidst the lingering atmosphere of colonial rule, a place where British traditions blended uneasily with Burmese culture. Rodney's job often meant juggling supplies, shipments, and logistical challenges. Yet, when evening fell, he would come home to the gentle comfort of Molly's piano. That piano, so far from the green fields of England, became something of a beacon, offering a small taste of the home they would eventually return to. In 1951, when Nick was just 3, the Drake family packed their belongings and journeyed back to Britain. Post-war England was in the throes of reconstruction, forging a new identity in the wake of lost empire and changing social norms. The Drakes found a house in Tanworth in Arden, Warwickshire, a sturdy, ivy-clad home called Farley's. If you ever wander along the tree-lined streets of that village, you might stumble upon the property's garden with its carefully tended beds and old apple trees that still bear fruit. It was a house that cost them around £5,000, which even then was no small sum. Nick would come to inhabit this place for the rest of his life, and it would shape his music in profound ways. The orchard outside his bedroom window, the rolling lawns, and the hush of rural England were imprinted on his songs. Those who've heard the hush in tracks like Riverman or Pink Moon can sense almost viscerally the presence of that countryside hush, a gentle quiet that makes his music feel like a secret revealed only at dusk. From a young age, Nick's mother, Molly, proved a central wellspring of musical inspiration. She was a piano player who was never content to merely mimic standard tunes. Instead, she infused her playing with subtle dissonances and a gentle melancholy that bordered on the poetic. Molly wrote her own songs, delicate, introspective pieces that often spoke of loneliness, longing, and the beauty of the everyday. Even as a toddler, Nick would wander around the piano stool, absorbing his mother's style as readily as breathing. This wasn't formal training. No stern teachers rapping on knuckles here. Rather, it was a quiet kind of mentorship, a passing of the torch from mother to son. He would later say very little about these early experiences, but one can't help imagining that those times spent listening to Molly's chords and lyrics planted the seeds that would eventually blossom into his own compositions. Nick's father was more reserved in personality, but deeply supportive of his family's musical pursuits. He might come home from a day spent surveying lumber and share an anecdote about the Burmese countryside or the shipping yards he managed, then settle in to listen to Molly and Nick improvise on the piano. The Drakes weren't wealthy aristocrats, nor were they struggling laborers. They fit snugly into England's post-war middle class, proud of their heritage, yet aware that the world was shifting around them. At Farley's, the quiet corners where Nick could retreat were plentiful. The dusty attic, the orchard, the small library filled with literary classics. It was an environment that nurtured reflection and creativity and set the stage for a young boy to develop into an unusually sensitive soul. In 1952, with Nick at the tender age of 4, the Drakes' life at Farley's became truly permanent. Nick's earliest memories included those orchard blossoms in springtime, the drifting chimney smoke in winter, and his mother's gentle voice echoing in the halls. He grew tall, uncommonly tall, reaching 6'3" by adulthood, but retained a certain shyness as though unsure how to navigate the space his long limbs occupied. It was at Eagle House School that he first dipped his toes into the formal structure of education, and later, at Marlborough College, he sharpened his musical skills. He played clarinet in school ensembles, tinkered with the piano, and even dabbled in the saxophone. During some performances, teachers recall how he towered over his classmates, all elbows and knees, yet handled his instrument with a delicate grace. What made him truly distinctive at Marlborough, however, wasn't just his height. He had a quiet, introspective nature that set him apart from the usual rowdy schoolboys. While others boisterously recounted weekend rugby matches or pranks, Nick would slip away to a music practice room, losing himself in the gentle swell of Debussy or the haunting lines of a Bach suite. One teacher famously referred to him as that boy who plays Debussy and then vanishes. Academic records suggest he excelled in many subjects, particularly English literature, a passion that would later weave itself into the tapestry of his songwriting. If he showed any inclination toward ambition, it was subtly masked. He collected A-levels with ease by 1966, seeming unhurried, uninterested in forging the typical path toward a bright professional future. Even then, it was music that called to him, beckoning him to explore new tunings on the guitar or quietly pen lyrics in the margin of his notes. During the summers at Farley's, Nick developed a habit that would become crucial to his artistry. He used his father's Grundig reel-to-reel tape machine to record himself and occasionally record his mother singing. Molly had written a number of wistful folk-tinged ballads, songs that spoke of longing, the fleeting nature of happiness, and the subtle ache of time passing. Nick would cover them, add his own harmonies, or experiment with chord progressions that meandered through unusual tonal landscapes. Somewhere in those recordings lay the embryonic form of the songwriter he would soon become. It was an art that developed in seclusion, shy and unassuming, like a rare plant that only flowers once every few years. In 1966, fresh out of Marlborough College, Nick enrolled at Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge, majoring in English literature. On paper, it sounded like the perfect match. A thoughtful, poetically inclined young man diving into the richness of the British literary canon at one of the world's premier universities. But in reality, Nick was already feeling the magnetic pull of the London folk scene. British folk music was in the midst of a quiet revolution then. Figures like Bert Chanch, John Renbourn, and later Sandy Denny were carving out new spaces for introspective guitar-driven songs that blended traditional balladry with more contemporary sensibilities. Nick, with his gentle soul and fascination for alternate guitar tunings, fit seamlessly into this wave. So while his family might have envisioned him attending lectures on Shakespeare and Chaucer, Nick's heart often wandered to dimly lit folk clubs where smoke curled in the air and audiences gave rapt attention to whoever was on stage. He also discovered the magic of open tunings on the guitar. Instead of the standard EAD-GBE tuning, Nick would twist pegs until the strings yielded haunting chords that seemed to ring with an almost mystical resonance. This inclination was more than a mere technical quirk. It spoke to a deeper urge to find uncharted emotional terrain through music. Once he sank into these open tunings, his songwriting leaped forward, producing chord structures that few other folk artists at the time were employing. You can hear it in nearly every track he ever recorded. That sense of a hidden door being opened, revealing a strangely beautiful corridor of melody and harmony. As the 1960s wound down, Nick's life took a decisive turn away from the halls of Cambridge. With his introspective temperament, the academic environment began to chafe. The folk clubs of London, by contrast, provided him with an underground scene in which he could share his delicate, intimate songs. Word started to spread about this tall, somewhat enigmatic young musician with the beautifully fragile voice. It wasn't long before producer Joe Boyd, an influential figure in the British folk rock movement, known for his work with Fairport Convention, took notice. Boyd sensed that Nick had a special quality, an emotional honesty that might captivate listeners if captured in the right setting. That setting became the studio sessions leading up to Nick's 1969 debut album, 5 Leaves Left. Recorded when Nick was just 20, 5 Leaves Left was a serene, introspective collection of songs that seemed to float effortlessly between jazz-inflected chords, folk lyricism, and classical grace. Tracks like Riverman or Cello Song shimmered with an otherworldly quality, augmented by subtle string arrangements that never overshadowed Nick's voice or guitar. Commercially, however, the record struggled to find a foothold. The British music press, enthralled by the spectacle of rock theatrics and the flamboyance of the late 60s scene, didn't quite know what to make of this gentle, undemonstrative figure whose songs felt like whispered confessions. Live performances were fraught for Nick. He often mumbled through minimal stage patter, rarely making eye contact with the audience, as if baring his soul in public was almost too painful to endure. Following 5 Leaves Left, Nick continued to write and record, forging a second album called Brighter Later in 1971. This time, the production was somewhat brighter, leaning into a jazz-tinged folk rock vibe that featured saxophones, keyboards, and a slightly more upbeat tempo on a few tracks. Yet the sales remained lackluster, and the critics still seemed uncertain about how to categorize his music. Nick found himself growing increasingly anxious and withdrawn, exacerbated by a sense that his songs, his most intimate expressions, were being received with indifference. He was quietly forging masterpieces, but the world wasn't ready to stop and listen. Personal struggles soon loomed. Nick began to exhibit signs of severe depression, though in that era, mental health issues were seldom discussed openly. He stepped back from live shows altogether after 1970. The prospect of performing on a stage felt like an unbearable strain on his fragile spirit. Instead, he retreated home to Farley's. He would sometimes appear at a friend's gig or record a stray demo, but mostly he wandered the house and garden alone, scribbling lyrics into tattered notebooks, playing guitar for hours without an audience. There were moments when his parents, deeply worried, tried to encourage him to connect more with the outside world, to see old friends, or to return to Cambridge and complete his degree. But Nick drifted further into an internal realm that few could enter. In February of 1972, with the help of Joe Boyd and engineer John Wood, Nick recorded Pink Moon, a stark, almost ghostly album consisting of little more than his voice, his guitar, and a few piano notes. Gone were the lush arrangements. Nick stripped everything down to its barest essentials. The title track, Pink Moon, clocks in at just over 2 minutes, yet it remains one of the most haunting statements in modern folk. It's as though Nick felt compelled to compress every ounce of emotion into those brief minutes, as if a deeper share might be too heavy to bear. When the album was released, it was met mostly with confusion or indifference, selling only a small number of copies. Critics, if they bothered to review it at all, struggled to categorize its hushed brilliance. In time, Pink Moon would be hailed as a masterpiece of minimalist folk, but at the moment of its release, it felt to Nick like another instance of casting his pearls into the void. By 1974, Nick's depression had become acute. He had tried therapy and antidepressants, but nothing seemed to alleviate the sense of existential despair dogging him. He moved back in with his parents, drifting through the familiar rooms of Farley's like a pale shadow of his former self. Stories from that time describe how he would often say very little, spending long stretches lying on his bed with the curtains drawn. Other times, he'd venture outside for a walk through the orchard or disappear on solitary drives through the countryside in his small car, returning hours later with no explanation of where he'd been. Family members grew deeply concerned, sensing that his internal battles were intensifying. On November 24th, 1974, Nick joined his parents for dinner, roast lamb and potatoes by some accounts, and hardly spoke a word. He watched a bit of television with them, then retreated to his room. At some point in the night, he swallowed somewhere between 30 to 40 tablets of tryptazole, an antidepressant known generically as amitriptyline. The details remain hazy, but it's said that around 3 in the morning he came downstairs to pour himself a bowl of cereal, something he almost never did in the middle of the night. Whatever was unfolding in his mind, it seemed contradictory, a mixture of despair and normalcy. The next day, shortly before noon, Molly discovered Nick lying face down on his bed, one leg dangling off the edge, his body already cold. He was 26 years old. The official cause of death was ruled as an overdose of amitriptyline, and the coroner determined it to be suicide while of unsound mind. Some close to Nick, including his family, later suggested it could have been an accident. Perhaps he simply misjudged the dosage, desperate for relief from insomnia and overwhelming sadness. The levels of the drug found in his bloodstream were significantly higher than the lethal threshold, but whether it was a deliberate end or a tragic miscalculation may never be conclusively resolved. To the outside world, his death was barely noted. A short paragraph in the local papers, a small circle of friends at the funeral, and that was it. On December 2nd, 1974, the funeral took place at St. Mary Magdalene Church in Tanworth in Arden. Around 200 people attended, many of them local friends or family acquaintances. Molly, heartbreakingly, chose to sing one of her own songs, Poor Mum, during the service, her voice trembling with grief. Nick's headstone would bear a simple, resonant quote from one of his final songs, From the Morning, which closes the Pink Moon album, Now We Rise and We Are Everywhere. If one stands there at the graveside reading those words, it's hard not to feel a sense of profound sadness for a life that ended before the world understood its beauty. And yet there's also a sense that Nick's music, in some intangible way, might indeed be everywhere, drifting through the ether. For decades after his death, Nick Drake's recordings were largely overlooked. Small cult followings discovered them, passing vinyl copies of 5 Leaves Left and Pink Moon around like precious contraband. These records, with their quiet intensity and elusive poignancy, nurtured an underground reputation that slowly grew over time. Musicians like Robert Smith of The Cure would cite Nick Drake as a major influence, referencing the intimate honesty of his compositions. The 1979 release of the box set, Fruit Tree, which compiled his 3 albums, brought a trickle of recognition, but it was still a niche phenomenon, adored by a small group of devotees who swore he was one of the greatest songwriters the UK had ever produced. Then came the year 2000, some 26 years after Nick's passing. A Volkswagen commercial featured Pink Moon as its soundtrack, introducing Nick's fragile, haunting tune to a mass American audience during primetime TV. Suddenly, record stores were flooded with requests for that mysterious song in the car ad. Pink Moon re-entered the public consciousness, and critics scrambled to reevaluate this singer-songwriter who'd slipped through the cracks of pop history. It was an ironic twist of fate. The success he never enjoyed in life was now blossoming decades too late, thanks to a car commercial. Pink Moon charted. The album sold far more copies than it ever had upon its original release, and younger generations discovered a voice that seemed timeless and achingly pure. The final image, perhaps, is this: a still evening at Farley's, the orchard trees swaying gently, the hush of rural Warwickshire, broken only by a distant bird call. Nick Drake is at his bedroom window, guitar in hand, gazing out over the moonlit grass. He's working through a new chord progression, listening for that perfect open tuning that might capture the ache in his chest. He plays a few notes, then softly starts to sing. The notes drift through the night air, reaching only the ears of the wind and the sleeping countryside. Few hear it at first, but eventually somehow the world will, and though it will be years later, long after his own voice has fallen silent, those notes will resonate far beyond this moment, lingering on, a gentle testament to the healing power of music and the enduring beauty found in a whisper.